This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Holt, and it's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. So far in 2021, I've looked at a lot of different stat lines, mostly the kinds of stat lines that aggressive creatures have. For example, I've taken a look at 1 mana 1/1s, 1 mana 2/1s, 1 mana 1/2s, and 1 mana 2/2s, and today we're continuing with that trend with a look at 2 mana 3/3s. 2 mana 3/3s have some pretty darn impressive stats, and it isn't a stat line we actually see that often. Only 39 creatures in the 25 plus years of Magic have it. However, of those 39, 13 of them have at least 1 point using my scoring system, meaning that about a third of 2 mana 3/3s end up being good enough for competitive play, and that's a pretty good rate. Obviously enough, because 2 mana 3/3s are so good, they do tend to come with downside to balance the card out, but as we'll see, that isn't always true. So, in this video, we'll take a look at the 10 2 mana 3/3s that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Mog Flunkies, one of the earlier 2 mana 3/3s the game ever saw. The downside here is that the Flunkies can't attack or block alone, but the good news is, you're generally only going to be playing this in an aggro deck anyway, so you aren't really planning on blocking, and most of the time when he attacks, he'll be doing it with plenty of friends. So the downside is real, but it can be minimized in the right deck. Mog Flunkies has gained all of its points in aggro decks. It was originally printed in Stronghold, but it got a reprint in Magic 2013, which gave it 2 separate shots at Standard, and it had some modest success both times it was legal. In the Standard of 1998, it was played in Mono Red aggro, and in the Standard of 2013, it was played in Jund aggro. Its remaining points came in Extended, where it was played in Goblins and Mono Red aggro. It doesn't have any points since 2013, and it isn't super likely to gain points in the future without another Standard legal reprint. At number 9, it is Watchwolf, which has the same total score as Mog Flunkies, but more Pro Tour top 8, so I gave it the higher spot. Watchwolf is just a vanilla 2 mana 3/3. That might not sound that exciting, but when this was printed in Ravnica way back in 2005, it caused quite a stir because it was the first time a 2 mana 3/3 had been printed with no downside at all. People were sure Wizards had lost their minds and broken the game, which, sounds familiar, right? In reality, Watchwolf is certainly a good card, but it is nowhere near broken. It gained points in Block, Standard, and Extended, and it did all of it in zoo decks, which were Naya aggro decks that ran a bunch of creatures with types you'd expect to see at the zoo, like, wolves. It isn't very likely to gain any points in the future without receiving a Standard legal reprint. At number 8, it is Albino Troll. This 2 mana 3/3 comes with the downside of Echo, which means you have to pay 1 generic and a green on your next turn or sacrifice it. That is significant downside to be sure, but paying 4 over 2 turns for the Troll really wasn't a bad deal at the time, especially because it came with the additional upside of regeneration. It gained all of its points in Block and Standard mono-green aggro decks. At number 7, it is Spectral Bears, the oldest 2 mana 3/3 in the game, being printed in Homelands in 1995. I guess if we need a slang term for a 2 mana 3/3, this is probably where we would look. It has the same score as Albino Troll, right down to the 4 Pro Tour top 8s, but it had a higher average finish, so I gave it the higher spot on the list. The Bears do come with a hefty downside. If your opponent doesn't have a black permanent when you attack with it, it won't be untapping on your next untap step. That might sound like a sideboard card, but Spectral Bears was played in the main deck for all 4 of its Pro Tour top 8s. This is because the Bears have a pretty reasonable fail case. They are fairly efficient as a blocker, and you can still attack with it every other turn, so it gives you something even if your opponent isn't playing black at all. And then when you did run into someone playing black, it just became a great attacker. Black was an incredibly common color for the opponent to play while it was in Standard 2, as Necropotence decks were dominating the field. At number 6, it is Ren's Run Vanquisher, a 2 mana 3/3 with Death Touch. The downside here is that if you don't reveal an elf from your hand when you cast it, it's a 5 mana 3/3 with Death Touch, and obviously, that's a lot worse. However, the elf decks that play the Vanquisher can almost always cast it as a 2 mana 3/3 with upside, and that's a pretty great thing to have. It gained all of its points in Block and Standard elf decks. While elves are a thing in formats like Modern and Legacy, the Vanquisher doesn't really make it into those more powerful versions of the deck, and as a result, it hasn't gained any points since 2009. At number 5, it is Serra Avenger, a 2-mana 3/3 with both flying and vigilance, and once it's in play, it doesn't even have any downside. The downside comes from the fact that you can't cast it until turn 4 or later. However, while that obviously makes this a worse card, the efficiency here is still so good that the Avenger has had multi-format success. Usually, when you play it on turn 4, you are playing one of the best creatures on the board, and because it's so cheap, it's quite easy to double spell, like by playing Removal and then the Avenger, and that's a pretty great turn 4. In Block, it was played in traditional aggro decks, but in both Modern and Legacy, it has gained the most points in Hate Bear and Death and Taxes. Both of these decks are white aggro decks that like to play creatures who disrupt the opponent's plan, and while the Avenger doesn't exactly do the disrupting, it is a great fit in the deck, since it isn't super interested in playing out the Avenger early anyway, since it wants to get down its disruptive creatures first. Also, both decks run Ether Vial, which can help you get around the downside of the Avenger, since the card isn't actually cast when you put it into play with the Vial. At number 4, I have Smuggler's Copter. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to include this, since it isn't a creature all on its own, but it's so easy to crew that it often just feels like a 2-mana 3/3 with all kinds of upside, and crew 1 is very minor downside, and not enough of one to make Smuggler's Copter anything other than amazing. Crew 1 is just crazy for a creature that has flying and loots when you attack or block. The Copter was so good in Standard that the whole format warped around it, with pretty much everyone playing creature decks so they could have access to the Copter. Ultimately, this led to the Copter being banned out of Standard fairly quickly, but not before putting up 35 points. It has also been banned in Pioneer. It actually hasn't gained any points in other formats just yet, but it has a bunch of top 16 finishes in Modern, so it's likely to gain some points there in the future. At number 3, we have Gilded Drake, a 2-mana 3/3 that you don't ever actually get to attack with. While it has impressive stats for the cost, you're going to be handing Gilded Drake over to your opponent. However, in exchange for that, you get to take their best creature, and there are plenty of board states where you'd rather give your opponent a 2-mana 3/3 flyer than whatever their best creature is. You can also then bounce the Drake to do it all over again if that comes up. It didn't see play in Standard or Block, but it did see a ton of play in Extended, where it was mostly in sideboards. It was mostly relegated there because of the fact that a card like this isn't going to be very good against aggro decks. Generally, you're going to be getting a worse creature than the Drake against them. However, it is great against decks that go big with creatures. It did see some play mainboard as a one of in Extended, where it could be tutored up by Survival of the Fittest in situations where the Drake could be at its most powerful. It didn't see any play between 2005 and 2012, but in 2012 it had a resurgence in Legacy, where it is a particularly powerful card against decks that like to cheat creatures into play with reanimation spells or show and tell, since you get their Gristlebrand in exchange for the 3/3. It doesn't have any points since 2019, but it is still being played some in Legacy, so it could add to its score. At number 2, it is Holt Pacifist. The downside for the Pacifist is that it can't attack unless you have a creature with power 4 or greater. Of course, it's also a werewolf, and that means that it can transform into Holt Butcher, a 4/4. The other nice thing about the Pacifist is that if you pump its power up to 4, it will be able to attack even without transforming. While in Standard, the Pacifist was played in a variety of aggro decks, with Bant Company and Selesnya tokens being its most frequent homes. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard. And at number 1, it's Fleece Main Lion. 2-mana 3/3s that cost a green and a white have come a long way since Watchwolf. Fleece Main Lion gives you great stats for a 2-mana creature and then comes with a pretty great box of text. In particular, it comes with the monstrosity mechanic. And sure, getting 1+1+1 counter for 5 isn't exactly something to be excited about, but the 2 keywords Fleece Main Lion can gain are pretty incredible, and are certainly 2 of the most powerful ones around in Hexproof and Indestructible. This means you can't use most removal spells on the Lion. It also means that it can attack and block without being concerned about ever dying. The particularly nasty thing you can do with a Lion is just to leave mana up for the monstrosity, since if your opponent decides you're going to try to kill it, you can just use it in response. The Lion was a key part of many decks during its time in Block and Standard, because it's difficult to beat this kind of efficiency. Early in its time in Standard, it was played in decks like Naya and Selesnya aggro. However, it put up the lion's share of its points in decks that dominated Standard starting in 2014, namely Abzan. Abzan was just a deck loaded up with hyper-efficient creatures all along the curve, and the Lion was the ideal 2-drop for the deck. So far, Fleece Main Lion has no points outside of block or standard, and that might continue to be the case. However, it has a huge lead on the other cards on this list, and its position here is probably pretty safe. Well, those are the 10 2-mana 3/3s that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these super efficient creatures, you'll find links in the description for each card that will take you directly to the card's page in the Card Kingdom store. If you want to make sure you catch more MTG Top 10s, subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the 370 plus Top 10s I've already made, including more that look at creature stat lines, you will see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you enjoy my content on this channel, consider subscribing to my other YouTube channel, Need to Hone History, where I talk about real-world history. Thanks for watching.